without further ado, if we could bring Catherine into focus. Catherine, if you wouldn't mind revealing yourself.
Superb, thank you very much. So I would like to welcome our keynote speaker for the Woven in Practice conference, Dr. Catherine Dormor. Catherine is a reader in textile practices and she's the head of research programs at the Royal College of Art. And I've very recently got to know Catherine through another collaborative project and was impressed to find out that Catherine's encounter with textiles actually came late in her career. This was a really good conversation starter for us to suddenly realise we've got a connection with textiles and this conference. I find it impressive that she also has a background in mathematics. Yeah, that's always a winner for me. But yeah, Catherine is a practicing artist and a researcher. She's also a writer on textiles and philosophy. And her recent book, A Philosophy of Textile Between Practice and Theory, recently published by Bloomsbury, is an exquisite exploration of language and materiality, and the materiality of textiles to develop new ways of thinking, writing and making. And that's, again, that just like sparks my synapses. I highly recommend this book. It's superb. In inviting Catherine to speak, I was really conscious of the importance of hearing about the backstories to how we develop a relationship with textiles, how we cultivate an appreciation of cloth, of the cultures of textile making. And I know that for many, practices of making are an embedded part of our daily lives. Textile making is a very meaningful pursuit in so many ways, whether solitary, collaborative, commercial, or hobbyist. And so this is kind of, I think, probably reading between the lines is part of what Catherine's presentation might be addressing. And the initial kind of title of her presentation was a question, which I think we could really all ask of ourselves, which is, how did I get here? But yes, over to you, Catherine. So I'm going to share my screen and I've got Catherine's presentation here.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rowan.
Okay.
So it's a real delight and a pleasure to be. Do you want to put it back to the beginning? Yeah. To be invited to speak here today at the Woven conference. I've called this presentation a love letter to Stitch. But just to give you a little bit of background, Rowan's given you a little bit already. I started life with some I didn't do very well in my A-levels, and I managed to get into Plymouth Polytechnic to read maths and statistics, which I flourished at. I left an all-girls school and went to Polytechnic and flourished. And I started teaching in secondary schools, maths. And I would say, if you've taught year 9 boys, 32 year 9 boys on a Friday afternoon, you're prepared for pretty much anything in life. But for reasons of early parenthood, work and finances, we moved out of London, and I was yearning for a more creative outlet. And so I became interested in ecclesiastical embroidery. You may well ask why. At that point in time, my husband was training to be a priest, and I did rather fall in love with the gold and the pomp and the circumstance, gold crowns, cloth of gold, couching, pomegranates, lions, snakes, dragons, crowns, and so on. I became hooked. And I worked in a freelance way, designing ecclesiastical pieces for a number of years: mitres, cassocks, copes, stoles, manipoles, pulpit falls, altar frontals, and so on. But let me warn you, there is no money in the church, and oversized copes for oversized clerics soon enough became slightly frustrating for me, particularly as I started to read feminist theory. So I enrolled on a distance learning textile program because I had small children. I couldn't travel very easily, and just learnt to love textiles in a whole new way, and the meaning and the language that sits behind it. And from there I moved on and did a PhD. And then I found myself teaching in a few fashion and textile departments before being offered the job at the Royal College of Art as the head of research programs. I was surprised, probably the most surprised to be offered the post, but I'm thriving there and really loving working with all of our research students and leading a number of projects to develop practice-based research at the Royal College of Art. It's a mad place, but it's great fun. So that's a little bit of how I came to be here. I am always surprised at how I got here, but I love it. So thanks to Rowan and the whole Woven team for making these events today and tomorrow happen. And thank you for inviting me. So this morning, I want to talk about the space of the stitch and its capacity to think about communality and collaboration, because really that is the answer of how I've got here. It is communality and collaboration. And as a hand and craft activity, stitch has become a mode for participative dialogue and a means by which to consider the tactics of making. In an industrialized context, the machine stitch is formed through the intertwining of two threads. It laminates the cloth and it creates a space of proximity and exchange. Both the hand and the machine stitch are contingent. They're precarious ecologies and they challenge and remodel concepts of space. In 2007, a really fantastic book by Joan Livingston and John Plouffe was a collection of text and visual essays, manifestos and other writings called The Object of Labour, Art, Cloth and Cultural Production. And this really spoke to my heart. It created a dialogue between the ubiquitous qualities of cloth in everyday life, the tumultuous relationship between cloth and labour, and its role within the ever-increasing drive of globalisation. And it is also beautifully illustrated. One of these essays by Nancy Gildart, a working artist trained in textile practices, calls attention to this ubiquity of textiles, both as real and as metaphorical forms, that were evident in the spontaneous and ad hoc memorials and displays in New York City after the 9/11 attacks. Next slide. Rowan?
Yeah.
Okay. This essay was evocatively titled Torn and Mended, Textile Actions at Ground Zero and Beyond. And it proposes the notion of textile actions as simultaneously intuitive impulse and artistic strategy through their capacity to create social space, generate communal dialogue, and the concept of collective response. And in this essay, she speaks about how so often people turn to textile actions after such events, both of celebration, but also of mourning and distress. She notes not only that these actions took place and their capacity for and of expression, but also the speed and spontaneity with which these material gestures sprang up. She calls these actions textile actions, and not to privilege cloth as the only medium present, but looks beyond this to textile processes, practices, and behaviours. In this sense, she also referenced the New York Times Portraits of Grief. Next slide. Which ran from 9/11 to December the 31st, 2001. And she recognised in them the quilt-like look of the pages and the gathering of images of missing loved ones on the fences, walls, and subway arches surrounding what we now know as Ground Zero. And yes, this evokes, next slide, the NAMES Project AIDS quilt of 1987 onwards. And with it, unlike collage practices, the organisation of these pages, fences and walls is punctuated and layered with brief evocative obituaries, flags and banners. They were signed, the handwriting forming quilting patterns across their surfaces. And unlike collage too, the different elements are stitched onto the background, the wall or the fence, and each other to create a holistic surface that wraps itself around the site of devastation. Gildart goes on to note the role of hand labour as a means by which to both address and potentially ease both individual and collective pain. It is almost as if these small actions not only gave wringing hands something to do, but also a small social space over which to exert some form of control, some sense of certainty and order amongst the chaos and bewilderment. It was almost a way by which to honour those who had lost their lives by acting to try to save others. Today, I want to use the work of Billy Zangewa, next slide, to think about stitch as a space of generous encounter. I will set out some of my thoughts that I've more fully explored in my recent book, A Philosophy of Textile Between Practice and Theory, and then I will make a performative reading, which I've called A Love Letter to Stitch. Billy Zangewa's work enters a space of great valency, but it is a subtle space that is concerned with what it might mean to be in community as a woman with agency. And Zangewa is located in Malawi, and her works initially were just observational, and increasingly she came to explore her own experience of being a woman in this community. The concept of belonging conjures readily the notion of community, the sense of being integrated or not, and this is a call to generosity. Marcia Meskimen, in her introduction to conceptual art and the cosmopolitan imagination, asks, who inhabits a global home? And by way of answering this, she talks of community as a space mutually and repeatedly constructed through dialogic and dynamic exchange, a reconceiving of subjectivity beyond the binarism of inclusion, exclusion. Such a mode of what belonging might mean reframes centric modes in favor of the edges. And she offers, next slide, spaces for opening ourselves to others through imaginative, and next slide, engagement rather than through assimilation. And aesthetics and ethics of openness towards the other. This is careful spatial creation that is strategically contingent and unsettled. It is a space of and for generous encounter. And building from Lucia Rigore, Miss Skillen proposes a mode of, next slide, belonging. And notice her brackets. So it is being and belonging together, caught up and bound with one another. She proposes this mode of belonging with other people that simultaneously builds outwards, through, and towards communication. It is a horizontal model of exchange that is intersubjective. It prioritizes the com, or withness, in the act of communication, and in so doing recognizes the I, the we, and the you in that relational interplay. It is a relationship that resists the reduction of the other as object to my subject and desire, enabling the others to engage as mutually and simultaneously desiring collaborators. I want to tell you a story, or perhaps two, but then again, maybe it's three. The seamstress. Next slide. A woman is stitching. It is a patched and pieced artwork she is working upon. She is carefully forming the image of a woman showering, piecing the fabrics, rich silks, to configure the tones and colours across the face, the torso, the arms, to more closely articulate the form in this flat 2D medium. As she stitches, she has in mind how she might display this work. She will cut away parts of the bottom edge, fray and fragment the edges, mount it directly, informally on the wall. This does not need the mediating edge of a frame. Its edges are porous and contingent. This woman, this textile work speaks for and from itself. Next slide. As needle and thread pass to and fro from back to front the base fabric through the layers of silk, she feels the movement of the woman's closed eyes. They are not firmly shut. They are softly closed and turn away towards the sky or roof. They look up and to the side. They do not look forward or back at the viewer. This is the look of a woman caught up in her own intimate meditation. Zangewa talks about a shift in her work from a narrative of how others perceive her towards one of self-perception. And she says, I think this shift came when I started to develop self-awareness and self-acceptance. Before this, I valued myself in relation to how others responded to me. And I think on some level, I started to wake up to the fact that the most important opinion is the one I have of myself. I then started to make decisions from this point of awakening and broke an engagement because I knew that I would be settling just to meet society's expectations, ultimately sacrificing my happiness in the process. Needle and thread move to front and back of the fabric. We are taught that stitching must have a rear as ordered as the front. Neat knots and finished off threads, no tangles or messes. This, like the perceived woman it depicts, is the discipline of a woman. It is training ground for the well-behaved. Next slide. The eyes and body rendered in cold shower become needle, barometer, seismograph, and compass. She is doing more than just personifying time and space. This word indicates the everyday dramas that sit undetected in habit-formed lives. The social fabric has now become Zangewa's material. Zangewa's needle and thread become nomadic, taking up an existence beyond the organized space of cloth, thread, and pieced sampler. But they remain bound up within it in the sense that a nomad's movements are bound up with territory, customary paths, moving from point to point. In contrast to a sedentary or static dweller for whom points or destinations determine paths, the nomadic way establishes paths and then points along them. For the seamstress then, the cloth, threads, needle and image are her way of being between points. It is about continuing to move within the process of making. The slow stitching of the softly closed eyes and naked body, their careful articulation in 2D that highlights the act of not seeing as more than an accident of missing some detail. It speaks to the deliberate and cultural act of looking, both the direct gaze, but the look of down and away. The storyteller. Next slide. A journey always begins with packing, selecting, deciding, choosing, re-choosing, this one or that one. Which of these, 2 or 3 of these? Have I enough? Have I too much? Will it all fit? And so the storyteller sets out on her journey, new experiences, new views of the world to bring back and possibly share. Next slide. Things and people seen, things heard, smelled, heard of, missed, imagined, and realized. Layer upon layer, fragments gathered together for later reflection, contemplation, and telling. Next slide. Each telling of the journey is an act of repeating, fragmenting, joining, and embellishing. It is all in the telling, but it is also all in the hearing as the fragments and parts of fragments and partly joined fragments embed themselves into the listener, now part of their story. This is what I call the story fabric, formed from fragments that are contingent and they're fraying. It is a performance, each fragment woven into the whole and then set free. The performance relies on this exchange between teller and listener. It relies on their companionship. And so the packing, the journeying, and experience of that journey becomes entwined and entangled. These are textile actions of threads passing between and around one another by the action of people and hands, selecting, telling, retelling, entwining and entangling together into community. Next slide. The traveller. As Hamid Nafisi writes, every journey entails a return or the thought of return. Therefore, home and travel, placement and displacement are always already intertwined. Return occupies a primary place in the minds of the traveller. Such images and imaginings of homecoming are built upon nostalgia and fantasy as they short-circuit the experience and the changes that such travelling brings about. Next slide. In Heart of the Home, Zangewa takes us on a journey into her home, the point from which we depart on our own. In the work, she renders carefully pieced and stitched forms of domestic furniture, mother and child, finely defined fabric sculptures, sparkling silks. The ensemble is the traveller's tale. It is departures, arrivals, displacement and retrievement. It is all edges and fraying. It is a web of connections. The kitchen scene carries a precariousness, inviting care for its parts. Like the traveller herself, the separate and combined elements create meaning from their juxtapositions. They give meaning to their counterparts. There is a generous form of encounter that speaks of their careful textile actions. By her own admission, Zangewa addresses gaps in history, looking for what is not said. She resists the concept of linear history, tidied up and presented by authorized and authority voices. She wants to reveal its knots, its tangles, its layers, its frays, its edges, and its layers and ghosts of production. So where Gildart talks of hand labor brought out of hiding and the ubiquity used to call attention to and address loss of the iconic World Trade Center and the people working within it, and those who sought to help them. She notes the many needlework and textile projects organized and the ad hoc that sought expression through action, these small actions of and by the hands. Next slide. Zangewa uses found textiles that are enriched with being discarded offcuts, vested as detritus. She resurrects them to meaning-making tools. And through these textile actions and installations such as Cold Shower, Heart of the Home, and An Angel at My Bedside, and this one, The Soldier of Love, she focuses attention on woman's narrative as multiple and mutable and entwined and entangled. And she speaks of the processes of storytelling, of discrimination, of exclusion. She uses sewing and stitching, often as a means by which space becomes made comfortable. She makes it uncomfortable, and she enforces new rhythms and claims on space. And the textile actions, as Zangewa deploys them, become sites of resisting old narratives and for challenging dominant narratives. It is for the listener to hear, and it is all in the hearing. Next slide. A Love Letter to Stitch, featuring artwork by Zena Katz, Miriam Metz, Kirsty McLeod, Billy Zangewa, and some of my own. Textile is activity. Is it playing, Rowan? Thanks. Textile is activity. Textile is technique. Textile is language, it is concept, but above all, it is stuff. Textile is ambivalent. It is a passage between, it is a becoming. My first hand is a sewing hand, a line of thread drawn up and down. It is rhythm, it is time, it is space. A stitch can patch, it can piece, it can repair, it can connect and hold. The needle moves back and forth, to and fro, thread following, drawing between the pieces. The stitch brings together, the stitch creates engagement and spaciousness. Back and forth implies repetition, rhythm. Time passes. The cloth economy is absorbent, richly absorbent of symbolic meaning. It comes into being by parts and inferences. The seam is a flexible join. Each piece offers veiled supplements to the other. They wrap themselves around the contours of the body. The seams are regulated transformation between the parts. And so running stitch becomes backstitch. It firmly anchors the parts together. Its circular motion of to and fro, backwards and forwards, a continuous connection along the line of the stitch. The stitch becomes the model of translation, a passage between signifiers and signifieds, names, objects, meanings. In fluid relationship, they commingle. The stitch affects permanent change. It is a field of possibilities formed around shifting and malleable elements. Together, they expand the fabric of language and understanding. The beauty of the stitch lies in its undoing. It is caught up with binding. It protects against separation. The hand stitch emerges from a single line of thread, passing to and fro, back and forth. The hand stitch is held together between the head, the lap, the torso, hands, and arms. Is this a maternal space? Both nurture and rupture take place here. The semiotic chora, complete union, reflection. Mother as same, mother as other. Bodily sensations. Thank you. Before signification, binding and stitching, a line of momentary penetrations, thread dragging through cloth, dislocating warp and weft. This is about access and egress, the process of birthing and giving birth. Existence begins with encounter, two before one. Seaming. There is a long time and a short time, gestation and giving birth. The seam gives way to seam allowance, the passages between fragments, a play between separateness and contiguity, the economy of the passage, the economy of passing through. The doubling and reversing of stitching, a space of production, the passage of needle and thread, the repeated actions of to and fro, back and forth. Which is the original? Which is the copy? The topography of the seam disavows, it inverts, multiplies, transfuses. The seam is speculum. It generates multiple reflections, multiple directions, subject and object, copy and original, mirror and images, passing to and fro between themselves, reproducing themselves within the passage of the seam. The seam is ambiguous. It draws together and it sets apart. It extends and sets a limit. It conceals and asserts the edge. The seam makes space between pieces. It is a crevice, a suture, a scar. For Ciccio, all texts are scarry. They are the result of an injury. The scar adds something, fibrous tissues that repair, a thickening. This is the method of and. Seaming and piecing. Brings pieces together at flexible joins of juxtaposition where thickening and scarring allow mutual exchange. Scarry meaning is oblique. It is mutable. It offers thinking beyond language, thinking through the surface. Scarry meaning accretes and accumulates, a space for undifferentiated polymorphous eroticism, for partial enveloping experience of materiality, seaming the sutured lesion. The process of language, of reading, like the seam, is of immersion, falling into the fold, between two pages, two pieces of cloth. To be somewhere else, the book, the cloth, both here and far away. This is a spare and pregnant space, ideas of language, secretion of knowledge, passage of meaning between bodies. Stitching gives form to time, but does not count in time. The metaphors of seaming are of containment, of exteriority and interiority, of surface and depth, of covering and exposure, taking apart and putting together. Trace. Don't put up my needle and thread. I'll begin to sew, Emily Dickinson writes. I am sewing, fetch the seam I missed. Still, I stitch. The performance of the seam, needle and thread passing up and down, to and fro, mimicking those that have gone before, but differing in the minutest ways. Like the repeated mimicry by woman of herself, the one, the many, a matrix of knowledge is formed. Each nomadic journey in turn mimics, creating its own performance, setting trajectories, speaking itself. The active body stitches the seam, a nomadic pathway, performing itself as it travels. The thread leaving tiny remnants of itself as it is dragged through the cloth in the wake of the needle. Thread and fabric, active forces on the other, reply and respond, answering back in the seam. Re-uttering, re-exploration, contingency emphasized, locatedness, irreducible difference. Seaming opens the cloth to the thread, seaming opens the thread to the cloth. Separation is undermined in the space of intimacy, proximity, performing the seam. Piqué. Piqué to prick, to stick, to pinch. Piqué steals, strikes and removes. Piqué gives back what it takes, serving the interests of the thief and the police. The seam, the stitched line, traces between, across and back. The needle pierces the cloth, draws thread through the surface. The piercing needle, the dragged thread, pierced cloth bring forth new possibilities and endless continuity. Benjamin, the storyteller, the traveller, the seamstress, they tell and retell the stories, they stitch and embellish, reframe and repiece the story fabric. It is its own performance, a dynamic of agency between bodies, multiple centres, multiple roots, a speculum, not a mirror. Seaming creates new cloth, the agency of bodies brought together, the agency of needle, thread and cloth, marking, mending, healing, scarring. Piqué bursts out from within itself, writer and reader in dialogic exchange, in seaming relationship upon the story fabric. We use our bodies to define space, a sustained and arduous task, critical urgency for the female body, seen through the optics of labour, recurrence of the female body as protest, as performative act. Textile folds time, citing and repeating and reiterating a continual return, a political necessity, a space of appearance, necessary complexity, a constellation of events, cacophony, dissonance, intangible evocative proximity. This is the communal space we give each other. We seem. Thank you. Rowan, I've got questions.
Apologies, just unmuted myself. Thank you so much. Thank you. It's amazing. I'm going to put out to the floor. Would anybody like to ask a question or have any comments to make? If you put into the chat channel or raise your hand, we can start the process. While we're waiting for people to gather their thoughts and turn them into sentences, Catherine, I just absolutely love the way that you are always weaving language in and through the textiles, and there's a real kind of poesis to that writing process. And I wondered whether you would be able to talk about what's the writing process like for you? How does it work for you?
I came to writing having avoided it for many years. So I mean, one of the reasons at school I chose sciences and then I went on and read maths was to avoid writing, because I really hated it at school. I hated reading and I hated writing, and didn't really understand how to improve, and so I just sort of avoided it. And when I did my textile degree, and this was as a mature student. I mean, I didn't start my textile degree till I was 40. So, you know, it didn't come to this early. And I discovered that weaving, stitching gave me language. They gave me structure. They gave me process. And I was able to find the words. And as I was weaving or stitching, I then wanted to articulate myself, and the words then came and the reading then came. So it was, a lot of my making is I do make artworks, but I also make to understand what I want to say. Mm-hmm. And I move between sort of writing sort of actual sort of sentences and structural work and paragraphs, and then this much more sort of pared back performative work, because they're both part of the process for me. So that's we've all, you know, working with textiles is what's unlocked language for me. And I can understand what I want to say through making.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And just to follow on from that, there's something interesting there that came to mind for me around, particularly when you're talking about, when we talk about the legacies of textile history and its reception. I think embedded within that history is feminist history. Mm. And I absolutely love that about textiles, that it's unavoidable, that you can't not engage with those feminist histories in terms of body, performative act, thinking through space, occupying domestic interiors, and negotiating them from the side of the female body. That's like, as a medium, I think textiles is receptive to that. It's an important core embedded part of the history, isn't it?
Yes, and I think I mean, Reseach Parker writes it so beautifully in the Subversive Stitch book, which was really groundbreaking and really highlighting that. And it's I think perhaps, you know, to some extent, perhaps there have been times, and there still are, where people sort of associate textiles and craft practices and stitching with the feminine and push it to one side. But I think if you look at the history of textiles, and if you look at, when you go to any city in the sort of industrialized countries, you'll find that actually at its root is textile production, textile making. Weaving. If you look around London, you've got sort of, you know, you've got Weavers' Lane and you've got Dyers' Row, and the medieval guilds were, I mean, huge part of them was around textile production, and they were both male and female working alongside each other, but it was male and female together, and often many of the names when you start digging are female. And then Reseach Parker also talks about Elizabeth I using embroidery and Mary Queen of Scots as ways of getting messages out to their supporters. So there's a whole history of women using textiles as a sort of subversive activity. The women at Greenham Common back in the 80s, they spun themselves a web, which they then lay beneath. And when the police came to try and remove them, they couldn't disentangle themselves from this sort of, literally, it's just wool that you would use for knitting a jumper. There's nothing offensive, but they were tangled in it. So, and they did a lot of stitching there, and Alexandra Kokoli writes about that extensively. So there, if you look through the history of women and feminism, and you look through the history of textiles, you'll see this relationship between the two, which is so extraordinary, that the power of the language that comes out of textile and the language of the practices, you know, there's nothing to look at, it's just knitting, you know, there's nothing to look at, it's just embroidery. So I think there's something really interesting, and really marries up with the way Lucia Rigore defines the sort of the female mimicry. So really, it's an amazing space to sort of lurk around in.
Absolutely, and this kind of then leads into what you were saying about textile action.
Yeah.
And is that something that you have been recently exploring, or are you able to talk about, you know, maybe now what are the forms of textile action that we might be addressing in the present moment, just in terms of?
Well, it was one of the reasons I brought Billy Zango's work to you, and also Zina Matz in the slideshow. Two artists, one's Brazilian, Argentinian, that's Zina, and Billy is from Malawi, and how they're using really beautiful textile practices to really explore the sort of actions of being woman in those cultural locations. And you're seeing now many more women using textile to really explore what being woman means, and as those textile actions, and they sit alongside a history of banner carrying, women coming together in making quilts together as a sort of act of actually we're on the surface of it making domestic, you know, useful products, but on the back of it actually space where they can talk to each other. So these textile actions are spaces of remembrance, but they're also spaces of subversion of the sort of phallocentric sort of powers. And I think there's something really, really interesting going on there when you sort of start to look into it. It's also very portable, and for a lot of women, that's very important, that it can be portable, it can be put away. So I think there's something. There's just sort of, it just persists, and I'm very excited about the persistence of textile in that way.
Absolutely. So I'm going to thank you, Catherine. I'm going to read out some of the comments. You've got some lovely comments, and then some questions. So Maya says, slightly speechless, so beautiful. Thank you. It was amazing. Amazing expressions of a simple stitch. Beautiful. Charles. So, Charles, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, of course. No worries. I was just, what's a politically correct way to do this? You have a job overlooking research, which to me is what we all dream, that we can guide future thought direction. But because so much at the Royal is controlled by budgets, what area would you adore to look into, but no one has ever offered the money to investigate that idea more? There must be things rattling around your brain, which when you relax, you just say, there must be something in there, but you've never been able to direct research towards it.
Well, in many ways, what I am doing is what I would like to bring more money to, is actually the power of textile practices as a means of thinking and articulating political thought. And as you know, in many universities, textile practices can very quickly become textile design or fashion and become oriented towards industry, if you like. And there is another industry that sometimes gets forgotten, which is that of political activism. So one of the beauties of my role is that I can do a sort of useful job of looking after the PhD students, as well as continue this research and promote textile practices as a really important framing for thinking and speaking through difficult issues. So that, and in that way, it sort of, I'm able to straddle both design practices and fine art practices. But more money to do that, and so that's why today and tomorrow's event up in Kirklees, the British Textile Biennial up in November, and the work that's going on in Manchester, the work that Leslie Miller does down at UCA, all of these, I sort of have feelers out into and trying to find ways of bringing all those activities together. So I try and use my position to do things like that, but I'm also working with Rowan and some others on how can we use some of these ways of thinking in this sort of dispersed and contingent way to build a scaffold to support Black and minority students into PhD study, because I'd like to see more of that as well, not just for textiles, but more broadly for art design and architecture. So it's using my thinking to try and think creatively and create and thinking in terms of a matrix and a web, rather than this linear, this is my discipline and where I sit. Does that answer your, it's a rather rambling answer.
No, that answers it ideally. And I'm one of Susan Postlethwaite team. So I want your job rather than hers, But can I ask a supplementary question?
Where am I moving on to?
Have you had any support from the Future Fashion Factory towards this investigation towards almost slavery type objectives?
I haven't as of yet, but I have had a few conversations with Susan, but I'd love to come and work with you a bit more. Yes, definitely. If that's
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Thanks, Charles. Just okay, moving on. Some more comments. Never thought so much philosophy goes behind stitching a piece of art. Thank you for opening another aspect to look forward. Writing and your writing and art is woven. Lovely play of metaphor there. Again, your writing and art are woven in an interesting and captivating way. Thank you. A question from Laura. Fabulous. May I ask where you did your textiles degree?
Yes, so I did my textiles degree by distance learning through a school that sadly is no longer in existence, called the Opus School of Textile Art, and in collaboration with Middlesex University. And one of my dreams, in answer to Charles's question, is there is a space now, and I think what's really interesting is that never waste a pandemic. There is a space for a distance learning textiles degree. And I think now is ever since the school closed in around about 2011, I would have wanted to see how we could resurrect it. And I think there is a space now to do that. And I think it particularly speaks to women, but not just women, but people who cannot access a physical venue across the globe. And for, you know, I mean, I did mine in that way because I had small children, and I just didn't have any other way of studying textiles. And it was a real, and most of the women on the course, and there were men, but most of them were women. There were people like women, wives of oil industry workers in Alaska and Canada, who, you know, just hadn't had the opportunities that are now available. They were slightly older, and then there were younger people as well with small children. So and people with caring responsibilities, and disabled people. So there were all sorts of reasons why people were studying distance learning. And to me, there's still a space. And as I said, I think it particularly speaks to a woman's space, but not exclusively. And I think this maybe we can find the means by which to make that happen in this post-pandemic world. So I'm going to have, my doorbell is ringing.
So we go and answer the door?
I'm just going to. I'm just going to quickly look at. No, I'm going to leave it. I'm going to leave it.
Sure.
Yeah, it's absolutely fine.
It's fine. But again, I mean, actually, just to follow on from that, in terms of the COVID pandemic and being in lockdown, actually, I think, you know, people have been able to experience ways of working in an online context, and particularly in terms of accessing, you know, new resources and workshops, all around kind of textile hobbyist activity. And I think that's been a real eye-opener about the possibility. It's you know, it can really be done, can't it?
Yeah, I mean, there is the Open College of the Arts.
Yeah,
there's some really great courses, but I think there is a space for something that's more embedded in an art and design college or a university, or more directly. And I still have that ambition to sort of to start that up or revisit, because it was so foundational and important to me at a very particular time in my life.
Absolutely. Amazing. Right. Last few questions. A comment from Monica. Catherine, could you weave a connection with slavery and textile manual jobs, having been always underpaid? I guess until the present day, handwork in textiles is always terribly underpaid. Textile art is often created by women who don't need to work. So is there a background of elitism in textiles too? Would you be able to comment, please?
I think I mean, Rowan and I have been talking about this with our bid that we're working on. It is an inherent problem in art and design, and I think textiles buys into that. And I think there's this huge separation between the sort of handwork that is really poorly paid and the creative work that requires money to do. And I really recognise that. And I also recognise that when you come to try and sell work, even as a sort of, you know, wealthy Western woman, people do not want to pay what it costs for a piece of textile work, for the amount of hours that it involves, even at below minimum wage. So there's still a huge amount of work to be done. And I absolutely agree. Modern day slavery is absolutely manifest in textile practices. And we need to speak out about that. And absolutely totally recognize your point. And there's a whole another piece of writing and work, not just writing, but work to be done on that. And I take your point entirely, and I have indulged myself by writing a love letter to Stitch today. But I hope, I mean, I'm right, I've just put together a proposal for a conference in the autumn on materiality and violence, and actually those thoughts are very much in my mind as I'm preparing that. So it is there.
And I would say the what you articulate in terms of, if we would call it a methodological framework for your research practice, that, you know, that you've developed a frame for thinking and speaking through difficult social and ethical issues. And I think that's like one mode of approach amongst many that is trying to, you know, critically negotiate the existing conditions or context that we're in, and how our subject areas are, you know, part of this kind of broader set of problems. So yeah, you know, We can't. We all have to do our own bit, don't we?
I see we've got 2 questions from Malcolm and David.
Yeah.
I do not forget men. Really, please do not think for 1 minute I forget men. And when I use the term woman, I don't only mean women, as I mean people who are in the often marginalized through the kinds of work they're doing. And so the space of feminism is not about women as a sort of separate. It's about the balance and the equity of opportunity and space. So I absolutely do not ignore men in any way, shape or form. It's just creating different discourses, different dialogues, and absolutely recognise what you say, Malcolm. And in terms of research into men who embroider, there has been a bit. Janice Jeffries curated an exhibition. Oh, it's so many years ago now. It's almost embarrassing for me to say it was recent, and it wasn't. Called Boys Who Sew. Obviously, they get criticism, which I think is a real shame. We're only prioritising them because they're men, and I think I don't think that's fair. So there has been, and of course, stitching and embroidery was really important for rehabilitation of male, mostly male war victims in the Second World War, and since. Stitching often and in prisons, there's the whole cell work project of working in prisons. Stitch and embroidery as a reparative or activity. So there's something really interesting there, particularly men doing what's often seen as sort of ridiculously fine work for male hands, but actually what goes in there. And I think in the quilt exhibition at the V&A a few years ago, there was quite a big focus on that. So there is, and I think it's a really interesting area of what happens when men stitch and what it does in that broader sense. And it does some of the same things I was sort of articulating in my paper, I think. But there's still space for more. I think, particularly as we see this rise in young male mental health and obviously the prevalence of young male suicide. There is something there that I think Stitch has been proven to do and can continue to do. So I'm absolutely there with you. But I think it comes out of this feminist thinking. It's another way of thinking that takes you off the sort of treadmill of the norm, as it were.
Brilliant, thank you. Rose, you asked a question here. I don't know whether we've addressed this, but I think we have in a way. How can the textiles work of Black and minority women be better placed in the narratives and the canon of textiles history when they're constantly being written out or are invisible?
Absolutely, and thank you for that question, Rose. I absolutely totally agree with you, and I think it's about joining with them and writing together, and signaling this work and really allowing those voices and those practices to come through. Not allowing, but really sort of celebrating them. And the Faith Ringgold exhibition at the White Cube, it was before the pandemic, so it must have been at least 2019, was utterly amazing. I took my husband along. He suffers textiles, I'll put it that way, and he was blown away by that. So and this work of Billy Zengewa and Zena Matz that I've been looking at recently. Some really amazing work. Zena Matz's work, working with asylum seekers in Paris, and doing the portraits of them, showing really extraordinary work. So I think it's about those of us in places of privilege bringing those names, bringing those practices up to the surface, and then allowing them to speak for themselves. I do not want to speak for other people, but I can use my place of privilege to signal, look here, this is where you need to be looking at. We cannot cast our eyes down in a way. We have to look out and forward.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I have is that sometimes we have books revised or brought back out, and they still, even in the revisions, they still ignore, or the voices of those Black women are still never put in the revisions. and it's as if or we have new books that come out, let's say the British history of knitting or the British history of textiles, and we still ignore the voices or those spaces. And I think if we continue to have academics or textile historians writing these histories, then how do we call out that if you're doing these revisions, where are our voices still? If you're revising,
I think you're absolutely right, Rose, and I totally take that point. And I think what's interesting there is making sure that new books are proposed rather than, because often what happens is a book is reissued rather than revised, and I think it's about either calling for revisions. So, for example, somebody now needs to write a response to Rosika Parker's Subversive Stitch that brings some of those histories out. I'm just finishing up editing a book with a colleague at London College of Fashion on transnational belonging and female agency in art practice. And in fact, my chapter, I'm foregrounding Billy Zengewa and Zena Katz specifically to bring those voices out. And when I wrote to them to ask for permission to speak with them, to interview them and for permission to use their images, both of them said, well, how did you hear about me? And that's the thing, it's about doing the work, doing the groundwork, finding out who's out there, and signaling to them. I think it's about calling for not reissuing but revising books. So let's do a revision. I mean, Rosika Parker needs, we need an update. Essentially, it's not a bad book. It's just it now needs to address more things.
Thanks, Catherine. Okay, I think we're going to bring this to a close because I'm aware, I just wanted to read a couple more things out. There's lots of people talking about distance learning courses and how they would totally love that kind of opportunity. Space Around Neat Stitch aspires to machine made versus free wild stitch as non-conforming. Those are valuable skills to pass on to children. Indeed, fascinating.
No more tea trays.
Yeah. I thank you so much for your time and generosity, Catherine, with regard to the presentation. It's really set us up well for this conference. I'd like to let everybody know that the next panel is on places, and that will start at 11 o'clock. But if we've got time, we're at 10 minutes to go and get ourselves a cup of tea, a bit of fresh air, grab a biscuit, or whatever we need to do. But we'll reconvene here at 11 o'clock. And I'd like to thank you once again, Catherine, for your contribution. Really much appreciated.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's been really great this morning, and I'll see you later.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.